straight on in to learning from these amazing organizers about the movement. So I want to first start by addressing James. One of the lead demands of the movement for Black Lives is to defund the police. And I know that the Anti-Police Terror Project has been working on this for the past 5 years. So can you explain what defunding the police really means and what the theory of change is?
Absolutely. And I'd just like to say thanks for everyone for coming. Thank you for putting this on. Everyone's been so great, and it's just really great to be here. As was mentioned, the Anti-Police Terror Project has been working on a Defund OPD campaign for 5 years, and y'all are going to hear my baby in the background as we go through. And really, as Black people in the United States, one of the largest obstacles we face is a lack of understanding from folks who don't share our experience. Right, so as a Black person, I can say that police don't make me safe. Like, they don't do anything for me if I'm in danger. And if I'm not in danger, I feel like they put me in danger. And that's a pretty consistent call from Black people across the country, but we find that people who have not shared that experience have a tough time adopting that framework, right? Like, they were raised venerating cops. They were raised when they were a little kid, you're 5 years old, I want to be a policeman when I grow up. Policemen have integrity and honor and all these things. Or they're just not our experience. And so we came up with Defund OPD as a theoretical framework to allow people who don't share our experience to understand. And I say that because when we're talking about defunding the police, instead of looking at the police as whether they're morally good or morally bad, we're looking at them as an investment, right? And so in the city of Oakland, for instance, we invest $330 million a year in the police, and that's 46% of all the dollars we can choose to spend. And so when talking to my neighbors in Oakland, specifically my white and non-Black neighbors in Oakland, I point out all the things that we could be doing with $330 million that would truly keep our people safe, like investing in housing for the thousands of unhoused people in the city of Oakland, or investing in mental health care, or just a number of different things, education, a number of things across the spectrum. And really get people's imagination going so they can understand that the police are an investment, and the police are and have always been a failed investment for Black people. And we really want to see that money shifted and that investment putting into things that truly keep us safe and really improve public safety.
Great, thank you, James. And I want to stick on this point of what we should be reinvesting that money in. So we heard a bit about, what we can reimagine that money going to in Oakland. Azadeh, I'd love to hear from you what you all are thinking of in the South and in Atlanta, in the work that you guys are doing to defund the police there.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Donna and NIAC for organizing and having us, and also thank you to James for your powerful remarks. So, similarly, to follow up on what James was saying, in Atlanta as well, we're working to abolish the Atlanta Police Department and shut down the jail. And there are many places that the money could be going to, as James said, the schools, healthcare. We're in the middle of the pandemic where we have seen nurses having to wear garbage bags for lack of essential protective equipment. So this is the state that our healthcare professionals and essential workers are in because there's no money. That's what we're hearing, right? And then at the same time, there's always money for police, there's always money for militarization. And so, when we say abolish the police, we want to defund the police and demilitarize communities so that the money could actually be going to infrastructure, to schools, to healthcare, to all the services that are actually going to keep our communities safe.
And I think a lot of people tend to conflate defunding the police and abolishing the police. So I would love to hear from both of you how you see those two things being similar or different.
For sure. So we think of defunding the police as a pathway to abolition, right? And just to zoom out, like a couple years ago, like even we've had this campaign for 5 years. 2 years ago, when we said defund the Atlanta or the Oakland police by 50%, it was laughed at. It was a non-starter politically, and it alienated even our allies away from the campaign, because no one could imagine taking that much money away from an institution that's so highly venerated, right? And so again, defund was an attempt to get a lot of people to take the first step on the pathway to abolition and start shifting their mind into a place where they could even consider abolition as viable, right? For a lot of people, when they imagine abolition, they imagine that the police disappear and then there's just lawlessness in the streets. And I think that that's just a societal failure of imagination, right? Because it's the only system we've ever known. And so defunding the police, we thought, as we instituted programs with the money we save from the police, let's say we took out 150 million from the police budget and put in programs that were demonstrated to improve public safety, you could start to get people to a point where they can see a future without police at all.
Right, and just to add, so there's a campaign called Aid to Abolition campaign that is being supported by Black feminists who have been also working towards abolition for a long time. And so the 8 demands are to defund the police, to demilitarize communities, remove police from schools, free people from prisons and jails, repeal laws that criminalize survival, invest in community self-governance, provide safe housing for everyone, and invest in care, not cops. And so, what basically these demands are getting to, and the abolition campaign, is that, we don't want any more reform. There have been many attempts in the past to try to reform police and the carceral system. And, there has been all this money and investment in more policing, more militarized gear for the police. And at the end, what we have seen is more killing of Black people. I mean, that's what, reform has resulted in. So, any campaign that continues to call for additional reform has no credibility. So what we need really is abolition.
I really want to stick on this point of the militarization of the police. And we all know that our police is highly militarized. My personal first experience of this was in college as a student at UC Davis, when I witnessed cops show up at our quad with full riot gear, pepper spraying Occupy protesters. And I know that now I now know that I had the privilege to not notice this militarization until I was in college. But I think a lot of people are having this same awakening right now after seeing the militarized response to protests this past month. So while the Iranian American community in particular does not have the same lived experience with the police that the Black community does, in large part because of our own assimilation to whiteness, we do understand the threat of US militarization in relation to Iran, from the 1953 coup that overthrew Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, to US sanctions and the threat of war that we experience today. So what would you say is the relationship between domestic state militarism and US militarism abroad?
I can start. So there's a direct relationship always. So tactics developed and perfected here domestically are then implemented on populations elsewhere that the US is invading, and vice versa. So, there were early instances of employing the tactics learned during the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines by the US in the US domestically. Also, the police using tear gas against protesters in the 1960s, as was used in Vietnam. So the US government actually using chemical weapons to try to disperse protesters. But also, and that's obviously very disturbing, any militarization of the police and the employment of the tactics against US protesters is extremely disturbing, and we should continue to speak up against it. But I also want us to be very cautious and act and speak up against this tendency for us to say, okay, well, we shouldn't militarize the police because, you know, those tactics are for elsewhere, for those other people. And, you know, it's supposedly then okay for the US military to go ahead and torture and kill people in Iraq, Afghanistan, you know, the Philippines, and also in other countries where the US, you know, government is training and providing military assistance or otherwise to those respective militaries, such as, you know, Yemen and, you know, as invaded and, you know, being bombed by Saudi, and, you know, Palestine, as, you know, is being subjected to the apartheid regime of Israel. So, you know, if we're working to defund the police, we cannot, you know, take that or talk about that as, you know, separate context from the military. You know, we're working to defund the police. We should also be for defunding the military, because killing and torturing people is wrong everywhere. And, you know, a positive development on that is that Representative Barbara Lee unveiled a plan to cut up to $350 billion from Pentagon by closing US military bases overseas, ending ongoing conflicts, scrapping weapons programs, and eliminating Trump's Space Force, which is definitely a space in the right direction. You know, at the end of the day, what we really need to see happen, in addition to abolishing of the police and dismantling, you know, the prisons and the carceral system, is ending US militarism and US imperialism and everything that is associated with that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your words on that. I really don't have too much to add, except that it's our responsibility as Black organizers to maintain the context that, as Ade mentioned, when we're doing our work. Like, that's one of the reasons why I'm here today on this panel, is because a lot of my mentors always speak about the movement before us, and how one of their greatest wants of that movement was to continue to increase international solidarity. And they've seen that wane since the 60s and since the Black Panthers were wiped out and a lot of folks were wiped out, and they really want us, they said it's incumbent upon us to bring that back and always contextualize the struggles, because all of our struggles are the same. And so really trying to do that and lift that up with our movement, and always contextualize militarized violence as something that the United States has always employed everywhere it goes.
Thank you for those words, both of you. I want to keep on saying I want to stick on, but I do want to stick on that point that James just brought up about learning from past movements. So I know Azadeh Project South, a lot of the work is steeped in Black radical traditions. James just mentioned learning from movement elders as well, in putting that into the context of the work that's done today. I'd love to hear from both of you how the work today is steeped in lessons learned from the past, or even built off of the movements that have started in the past. James, I'd love to hear from you first, and then Azadeh, if you can follow up as well.
For sure. I live in Oakland, home of the Black Panthers, and their tradition is alive and well in the city. And so I think really for me, if I ask my mentors to trace their lineages, that's directly where it would go. And in moments like this, that's definitely a conversation that we're having, when in a moment when it's rumored that the FBI is coming to town, in a moment where state repression can really start taking some of its scariest forms. We're always reminded of the maxim from our elders that the state always takes us more seriously than we take them. Right, and so I think for us, it's just always a reminder that we don't have all of the elders that we should, and we don't have all the ancestors that we should. We don't have, we're missing generations because they were wiped out by COINTELPRO and the United States government. And so we need to, right now in these moments, like learn from the elders we do have. Then we need to be our own elders and provide a safe framework for those who are coming after us. Because we need to, it's the loss of the Black Panthers set back the movement. The whole COINTELPRO set back the movement tremendously. And we're still trying to build up some of the programs that they had running effectively, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so it's just one of those things where we really take seriously all of our activists who are engaged and try to make sure that they stay well in all of the ways as we move forward.
Definitely. Thank you so much. So yeah, Project South, we're based in Atlanta, and we work with communities and grassroots organizations in the US South. And basically our cornerstone is the Black radical traditions of the US South. And just, some essential principles is that, we know that we're in this struggle for the long haul. So we're trying to organize and build social justice movements. We have the traditions to look up to, so legacy of success because of organizing and grassroots movements. People relying on internal resources as opposed to external factors. So just knowing that the knowledge that nobody's gonna come save you. There's an internationalist tradition, as James mentioned, the idea of joint struggle and directly impacted folks leading this struggle. So just, a couple of examples of how those principles are a guide for our daily work. So directly impacted folks leading the struggle, we're part of a coalition in Atlanta trying to shut down the city jail. And that coalition is led by formerly incarcerated Black women and trans people, many of whom were actually incarcerated at the Atlanta City Jail. So basically, we take our cues from them and see how we could be of support rather than trying to, dominate the movement in any way, shape, or form. And also in terms of looking to ourselves and our communities' resources, Project South and the Hunger Coalition, we were engaging in mutual aid. Our building is actually called the Mutual Aid Liberation Center for a couple of years now. The idea being that, we need to be relying on each other and the resources that the community has, because everybody among us has a skill that we can teach the others among us. And so we have a community garden, again, teaching each other the skills we do have. And then since the pandemic hit, our building that used to be kind of serving as a community place, and some of those gatherings couldn't happen anymore, but we still could do some things. My colleagues have been getting together every week in terms of preparing packages for the community in South Atlanta, where our office is, which I should mention is where Rayshard Brooks was gunned down by the police about 10 days ago. That's about a couple blocks from our office. So, due to our strong ties with the community in South Atlanta, basically, preparing whatever the community might need and then taking it to them, and then also learning about the needs to inform the conversations for organizing as well.
Thank you both for those thoughts. I think oftentimes folks think that these movements kind of happen in a vacuum, that they just kind of pop up out of nowhere. So I think it's really important that you all shared that it really is steeped in history, tradition, the work of so many other movement leaders from the past. I want to bring up another topic from the past that isn't really the past that James brought up, which is COINTELPRO. So there have been disturbing amounts of state surveillance at protests directed at movement leaders and at the protesters. So my understanding is that many of the surveillance tactics used are the same ones developed by COINTELPRO. So I can't help but think of the irony when our country's leaders claim that we have moved so far forward since the civil rights movement, yet the state is still using some of the same tactics now that were developed with the goal of systematically targeting and undermining the civil rights movement and the Black Power movements. So this is less of a specific question and more of a curiosity on my part to just hear from both of you what your thoughts are on that. James, I would love to hear your opinion first.
For sure. I'm troubled. Those are my thoughts. I'm troubled. I think we've watched over the last 5 years or so, or at least I've been watching over the last 5 years, as surveillance technology has been passed without resistance across the state of California in municipalities, because everyone's focused on something else, right? And understandably so. There are atrocities happening at the border. There is a migrant justice movement that needs allyship, and so folks aren't necessarily focused on surveillance technology. And at the same time, laws are being passed that allow drones in the sky. Laws are being passed that allow cell phone spoofing towers, towers that track the cell phones that are in a given area, to be, and I'm not talking about fancy cities like Los Angeles, like Vallejo, California has a cell phone spoofing device, right? They're not expensive to get, and you just throw it on the budget, and if nobody's noticing, and then you have one, right? And I think that's one of the things I was trying to bring up in the militarization conversation, is that there's just so many atrocities going on in the United States. It becomes very difficult to bring together a coalition that can focus and defeat just one at any one time. And so with surveillance, we see that to be one of the hardest to stop, because the threat is always so remote, right? It's like, well, everyone has my data anyway, or there's cameras everywhere anyway, or data aggregation is a thing anyway. And it's like, yes, and we as a society should be thinking about ways to stop these things, but it's almost like this feeling that we, of complacency, like we gave up the fight against surveillance, and it leaves folks like me and like Azadeh and like so many others very unsafe, right? And not only activists, it just leaves normal Black and brown communities very unsafe. Like, I think one of the things that people miss is whenever there's militarized equipment, it goes to the most marginalized and oppressed communities. That's where it is used, and that's where it's exploited. And so the government buys out, they go across the world, hear about all the nicest toys out there, military toys, and they come back to the United States and they use it in the hood. And so, and then to lift up, as Azadeh mentioned, they use it across the world as well, right? And so it's really important and incumbent upon us as movement workers to make sure that this fight stays visible. But it's also important on a personal level for us to understand what threats we're exposed to. Because it's not only, when the surveillance technology exists, it's not only the state that can be the actor that causes you harm. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Boogaloo Boys, which is a silly name but they're right-wing extremists who are shooting and killing and bombing and framing activists across the country. And they avail themselves of the same surveillance technologies or slightly lesser surveillance technologies than the government avails itself of.
Yeah, definitely. So, definitely it's really disturbing. We know that there are documented instances of the FBI going after Black activists, even before the recent protests, and it's been going on for so long. But also recently, we know that even Custom and Border Protections flew a drone over Minneapolis during the protest, and that the military is even actively monitoring protests in several states. So just, putting my lawyer hat on, people really should be protecting themselves. The National Lawyers Guild has several pamphlets, Know Your Rights pamphlets in several languages. Please take a look at those and just, gain some, just familiarity with what your rights are in encounter with law enforcement. But also, if the FBI comes to the door or to your workplace, or just approaches you on the street, or the local police for questioning, please be sure to get yourself a lawyer. You can contact the National Lawyers Guild, which has chapters in many states, including a very active chapter in San Francisco. And also, if you're in the US South, please feel free to contact Project South, because none of us should be talking to law enforcement without a lawyer present.
Thank you for that, both of you. And I know a lot of people on this webinar are probably now thinking, oh, where can I find those resources? So we'll make sure to follow up with Azadeh to get those links and share them with everyone here today. I want to go back to the campaign of defunding the police to kind of round out this conversation before we move to audience Q&A. So James, you may already know this, but California is home to the largest Iranian diaspora in the world. So many of our members, myself included, are from the Bay Area and live either in Oakland or in the nearby suburbs. So I would love for you to share some of the tactics and also some of the targets that you all have chosen on your campaign to defund the Oakland Police Department.
Absolutely. So in Oakland specifically, we've been targeting the city council and the mayor for the last 5 years because those are the people who set our budget, right? And we've been working in coalition with folks not only in the county of Alameda, but also across the state to coordinate budget efforts as well. So if folks are in LA, they could talk to folks like Dignity Empower Now or Black Lives Matter Los Angeles about their budget fights, or if they're in San Diego, they can talk to Black Lives Matter San Diego as well. And so, again, the campaign to defund the police is focused locally because that's where we have the most pressure and that's where we have the most power, right? In the city of Oakland, if I can get 10,000 people behind a demand, it needs to be taken seriously. In the state of California, if I get 10,000 people behind a demand, it doesn't need to be taken seriously, right? It could be from one district. And so it's important for folks to know that defund is a local strategy first and foremost. Second, it's important for folks to know that defund has already been watered down in the language that folks are using across the country. So for instance, Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles said he defunded the police and they gave the number, which was $150 million, and then didn't mention that's only 5% of a $3 billion LAPD budget. Right, London Breed tried the same thing in San Francisco, and I'm sure they're going to try the same thing in Oakland as well. And so politicians are already understand that this is not an area where they can actually defund the police and maintain their political viability. I think one of the strongest things about the defund campaign is it exposes that the police lobby is so strong that a lot of politicians just don't go against them for that reason alone, whether or not they're ideologically aligned with the cops. And so this draws out that contradiction and says, well, even if you can like cops and still agree that they shouldn't get $330 million a year, but what folks don't understand is the police will not let you touch their budget. They will not let you touch their officers. They're a incredibly protective union because they're used to being the most powerful people on the block, right? I know if you've seen the viral videos that are going across the country now of cops giving press conferences and kind of yelling, they're all tone deaf because I think that they're used to this world where they're seen as the venerable and honorable ones, and now across the country in the media, they're seen as the disgrace that Black folks see them to be, and so there's really a moment of contradiction. But to loop back to defund, for folks who are trying to get involved locally, I think it's really important to know that this is a Black abolitionist movement first and foremost. And so I worry when folks are starting their own defund chapters who are not rooted in a Black abolitionist praxis, that they're susceptible to losing some of the core of why we're doing this when they're making their demands. And so please ground yourself in someone who has that knowledge or is in that work. There are brilliant Black organizers everywhere, and if they're not visible, that means they're doing work behind the scenes. And so it's always about, for me, it's always about allies trying to find those folks and give them power and lift up their power and give them these tools as opposed to employing the tools themselves.
Awesome. Thank you for those powerful words, James. So I want us to start closing out this section and moving to audience Q&A. So I'm going to ask you all one last question, but before I do, I want to remind folks that if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box and make sure that you're checking the chat feature as well. Our behind the scenes NIAC staff will be chatting you if you submit a question to see whether or not you're comfortable asking it live on the webinar. So make sure to start sending in your questions now. And then my last question for you all is just final thoughts. What do you think is the one thing that people on this call or at this Zoom meeting should take away whether it's around defunding the police or the larger movement for Black lives. Azadeh, I'd love for you to start first and then for us to close out with James.
You know, what James just mentioned was really important in terms of, you know, none of us trying to kind of recreate our own organization, you know, when there are so many Black-led organizations and Black organizers doing really important work on the ground. So definitely, you know, support Black-led organizing, grassroots organizing efforts. And you know, see where you can get involved. You know, it's about defunding the police. It's about shutting down jails and prisons. I would also urge folks to not forget about immigration detention centers that are currently imprisoning many Black people, especially, you know, in the midst of a pandemic where people are facing, you know, potential death. And then also, you know, something that we didn't get a chance to talk in depth about, but, you know, probably an immediate step that folks could take or could at least try to push their localities to take is to end the police exchange between the localities and Israel, which is where, you know, a lot of these police forces are learning even more militarized, aggressive, violent tactics, you know, from an apartheid regime. They're learning it and then coming back and implementing those same tactics on Black folks and communities of color here. And, you know, we see that the interim police chief in Atlanta has already gone through this training in Israel, and that, you know, the case is the same, you know, in many places around the country. So there is a movement to try to end the deadly exchanges. You know, Durham, for example, already put an end to that. You know, there's a locality in Vermont that did that. We're trying to do that in Atlanta. So, you know, hopefully folks can get involved and expose that as well.
I love that demand. I know that LAPD has an intimate relationship with Israel and gets a lot of their technology from Israel. I also want to lift up that the United States gets a lot of technology from Brazil as well. And so really just lifting up and making sure that we highlight those international exchanges and how much so many of us disapprove of those exchanges. And then the other part, I think, and I usually say this if it's a new audience, is just I encourage everyone to believe Black people. I know that as a Black person, I've been saying all the things that I'm saying this month for years, you know, if not my whole life for some of the things. And I find that it's scary to say them in many circumstances, or I'm gaslit, or I'm disbelieved, or it's minimized, or there are other microaggressions that happen. And so finally in this moment, it feels like everyone is listening and like saying, oh, that must be terrible for you. And so I encourage everyone to take this moment of collective curiosity, where like as a society, we're all saying, hey, it's okay to not know anything about Black people. Like all questions are on the table right now. Just like find the appropriate person to ask them to and then ask away. And so I really hope that everyone takes advantage of this moment and then tries to make a sustainable practice of engagement with Black people, right? Because we have 1,000 people who said they want to volunteer for APTP in the last month since the movement started. And I'm sure that 900 of those people, all well-meaning folks, will not have the energy or the time to volunteer a couple months from now when this isn't the moment. And that's no shade, that's how it works. Any organizer knows that. But we're encouraging people right now to think about not what you want to do for me now, but what you can do for me 6 months from now. Whether that's, an hour a week or no time at all. Just being very real with ourselves about how much capacity we have, because we live in a society that robs us of our capacity, and how much we can devote to movements other than the ones we call our own.
Awesome. Thank you both for those final thoughts. And I really encourage all of you who are watching today to get involved locally. If you're in Atlanta, check out Project South. And if you're in the Bay Area, check out the Anti-Police Terror Project. To that end, I'm going to post some social media handles for you to check out now from both organization and also Azade's personal Twitter account. But I also want to highlight that the movement needs people, but they also need funds. So I'm also posting the donation pages for both of the organizations represented here today. So really encourage you all to not only consider donating your time, but also your dollars to make sure that, you know, these amazing organizers can continue doing the great work that they do. So we are going to move on to audience Q&A. So again, if you have a question, make sure to send it in the Q&A box and check the chat to see a message from one of our amazing back-end staffers. But I'm going to first call on Ozita, who has a question for the panelists.
So thanks so much to NIAC and the panelists for this incredibly important conversation. And I especially appreciate the comments on how a militarized state impacts us all, albeit in different ways. James, to a little bit more about opportunities for solidarity between Black Lives Matter and anti-imperialist activism, and especially about how these coalitions and our organizing strategies have to shift in the coming months, since we have this trifecta of COVID, the presidential elections, an economic recession, and of course, this global shift to right-wing fascism. So what do you see as the ways that we can be most effective in coming together in coalition? And Azadeh, I really appreciate your reference to the work of Black feminist abolitionists. I encourage everyone on this call to really check out Angela Davis and Ruthie Gilmore's work. But I'm wondering if you can offer some more thoughts on how Iranian diaspora can not only stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but explicitly address anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism within our own communities. Thank you.
Those are great questions. Thank you so much. I think in this moment, what I'm asking folks to do, and this is, I think, more of my personal opinion, is find folks who are doing the work locally and support them sustainably, but then also like do your own housekeeping. Like who is your community, and what does anti-Blackness look like in your community, and how can you root that out? I find that in moments like this, we're all excited to join a group and do a thing. But like if we could take our book club or the people that we eat lunch with once a week or any group of that size or that sort and just push them and challenge them from being someone who just thinks of themselves as not a racist to becoming an anti-racist, that's a huge victory, right? Because then there's another person on the team.
Awesome, thank you. Azadeh, I wonder if you have any thoughts, as an Iranian American yourself, on Azita's question about confronting anti-Blackness in our own community.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to echo everything James just said. We all have a responsibility to just counter and shut down anti-Black racism in our communities. And I'm really glad that NIAC is going to be organizing a follow-up conversation on this issue. Please invite everyone in your community to join that, because, this is a process for us, and it starts in the house, and then, broader than that, we, as James said, we need to, we all need to, work towards becoming anti-racist and confront anti-Black racism specifically. And, it takes work, it takes education, it takes just standing up to racism and shutting it down. Every opportunity that you get, we need to do that.
Great, thank you. So next I'm gonna call on Layla, who also has a question for our panelists.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great.
I can hear you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And hello, little baby. Thank you so much for joining. I've actually myself learned a lot from this panel. And so now I'm actually a little bit curious, kind of quoting you, James, to understand what I've heard a lot of calls for, like increased training of police as opposed to abolition, or transferring nonviolent complaints and crimes to like healthcare workers, social workers, and then more violent crimes to the police. I want to understand like maybe what your response to that, and if that is adequate or not, or if that's an inadequate response to calling for defunding and eventually leading to abolition. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
For sure. This is Audrey. Audrey uses they, them pronouns. Newest member of APTP. And thank you for your question. To the increased training, my answer is no. We don't want any more funds to go to law enforcement at all. And not only that, that would be assuming that training works. Training just ends up giving more money to law enforcement, and we get the same results. Right, you know, there hasn't been a training course where they were like, well, and then all of a sudden police stopped killing people because that's what police, that's what they do. It's, you know, if you have a system of policing, they're going to kill Black and brown and indigenous and LGBTQ and disabled people systematically. And so we don't think that there's you know, and history has borne this out when it comes to training and reforms and body cameras. All of those things have been tried, and police get around them every time. Right, and so to your second question, what about replacing police functions with non-police? I like that idea. The way you phrased it makes me a little concerned, because what the state is trying to do is turn invest in existing state functions that already serve to promote white supremacy. Right, so I don't want to divest from police and have it be invested in the charter schools of Oakland, right? Because those schools were not built to serve Black people, right? And so when I say invest in education, that's a start. But what I'm really saying is invest in community-based organizations that have demonstrated that they keep our people safe, that they improve our outcomes for folks. And so, for instance, there's a group called Mental Health First in Sacramento. And they do crisis intervention without law enforcement. And so what they'll do is, someone's in a mental health crisis, what they'll do is they'll send out a crew, and they'll even have a liaison just in case law enforcement comes, to de-escalate law enforcement and make sure they stay away so we can keep our people safe, right? And so when we say invest in community, that's what we mean, because yes, Audrey. Because it's not only the formal systems that we create. Communities have been keeping themselves safe forever in the United States. Often their work is invisibilized, but you imagine if you're an undocumented community, you can't just call the police. You can't avail yourself of our system of policing, but you need to be able to keep yourself safe. And those systems have been developed, those systems have been practiced, and it's about finding and investing in those folks who have a demonstrated history of really keeping communities safe because they understand the communities that they're working with.
Definitely. And just to follow up, you know, in terms of more resources going towards the police, again, you know, echoing everything that James said, and people should remember, you know, just as an example, there was all this money going to the Minneapolis Police Department for reform, you know, like the best supposed reform, and then, you know, see what happened. So, you know, with the murder of James Floyd and, you know, all the other instances of police brutality that this department has recently implemented, I mean, has, you know, has come out of this department. So that, I think, should show you that reform does not work. And so I think, you know, that history, and also just the organizing of folks, you know, in Minneapolis, just forced the city council basically to go ahead and call for the dismantling of the police department, and hopefully they will be held accountable to actually push forward with that demand.
Thank you so much. That really was very informative. Answered all my questions.
All right, thanks, Layla. Next, we have an anonymous question that came in. So following the death of George Floyd, what are some changes, either local or state, that you have seen that give you hope for racial, criminal, or social justice in this country?
Man, it's hard. Whoa, sorry, my baby almost just disconnected me. It's hard for me to. I think I look at movements just a little differently. I think that the outcomes that we're seeing now are the result of the work that has been done over the years before this. And so, as an organizer, I'm definitely hopeful, and I have definitely hope that we can defund the police, and that's my objective on the way to abolition. And at the same time, what I'm looking at is the work that's being done and the messaging that is being used, and trying to continue the fight, the battle of public opinion, which is one of the reasons why I'm on this panel, which is one of the reasons why we've been trying to be out here over the last couple of weeks, is because people still think reform works. 8 Can't Wait got a lot of attention across the United States. I really appreciate us today bringing 8 to abolition up, because I don't want 8 Can't Wait. We've been fighting with D-Ray and Campaign Zero and Sam, or publicly disagreeing with their approach for a minute, and so it's really incumbent upon us as organizers in this moment to not only be brave and get as much as we can off the table. Like right now, we're asking for 50% to be reduced from the police budget, but also to be positioning ourselves moving forward, right? The state is very good at co-opting our movements. The state is really good at taking our buzzwords and poisoning them against us, right? You used to be able to say white privilege, and then white people ruined that, and then you could say white fragility, and then white people ruined that, and then you could say Black Lives Matter, and then they said all lives matter, and then, right? These are deliberate attempts to water down effective messaging campaigns, right? And it's not like these messaging campaigns, you want to be on the screen. Okay. It's not like these messaging campaigns came overnight. These are things that we've worked on for years, so it's really important that we be careful with our words and we be careful with our messaging in moments like this, so we can make defund, get as much out of defund as possible before the Joe Bidens of the world water it down.
Awesome. Thanks, James. Also, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and definitely I agree with everything that James said. I think there is something positive with all the energy of, folks on the streets. I think the trick is to, as James mentioned before as well, to ensure to direct the energy, to the right place. I mean, we saw some of this happen too after Trump got elected. All of these, primarily white folks, all of a sudden kind of woke up and they're like, what can we do to support immigrants and Muslims and people of color? And then there was a tendency to create all of these new organizations and new initiatives that actually was harmful to the work that Black and brown and immigrant and Muslim folks had been doing on the ground for a long time in a grassroots fashion. So I think that's the trick, to make sure that these folks are actually supporting Black led organizing on the ground, and to make sure that people are not supporting reformist initiatives, because again, what we need is abolition.
Awesome, thank you. So next on stack, we have Mahyar.
Hi, thank you so much for the incredibly interesting discussion this evening. And I guess my question for both of you is per the conversation that you all were having around the 8 Can't Wait and the Campaign Zero policing reform proposal to the 8 to abolition and the calls to defund police. Would love to hear both of your thoughts on the current congressional response to policing happening with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act coming out of the House and the Justice Act coming out of the Senate. Would really love to hear your thoughts in terms of the differences between really what folks are calling for on the ground in this moment, between the sort of measures that are moving in Congress currently. Thank you.
For sure, that's a great question. I find that the levels of inertia that you see, the level of inertia increases as you go from local movement to state movement to national movement, right? So whereas in local, like we saw in Minneapolis, things can change. If there's intense political conditions, things can change overnight in a way we never thought possible, right? But like white supremacy, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, these are systems that have evolved for hundreds of years to be resilient, right? And bend but don't break is the way I think of these systems. And so in this moment, you can see each political actor bending as much as they need to without breaking the fundamental systems of white supremacy, right? So, you know, whether that's at the local level, really cutting a police budget by maybe $100 million, but you'll still have police though, right? And they'll still have several $100 million and they'll still be able to protect your property, right? Versus at the national level, there isn't that much pressure. So they can, you know, they can put a bill together that says whatever they want. They can take a knee with a kente cloth on, which is unfathomably offensive, get their photo op and call it a day. And so politicians always do as little as they have to do to get by, because that's the nature of the system. And so we're seeing that in effect at different levels right now.
Awesome. Azadeh, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I want to add is, again, echoing James in terms of, you know, we need to be focusing locally. I know in Atlanta, you know, the city council narrowly defeated a measure to just withhold an ordinance that was going to withhold police funding, some of the police funding. So that's where we are. You know, we need to intensify the pressure to get that going. And as I mentioned, and the police exchange between the city of Atlanta and Israel. So, you know, I think the work really needs to happen locally. You know, that's where we can hold the politicians accountable. You know, on that, I really loved a movie clip that came out of a video clip that came out of a rally in Minneapolis, where the supposedly progressive mayor who wanted to speak at this rally was really called out. You know, they didn't let him to come on the stage until he was ready to commit to abolish the police. And they're like, it's a yes or no answer. Are you going to abolish the police or not? And he's like, well, no, I don't think so. Not fully. And then they're like, okay, then shame on you, go away. I mean, that's what we need. You know, these supposedly progressive people. And, you know, we have plenty of them in Georgia, you know, it's like all the nice rhetoric and everything. But at the end of the day, when it comes to action, they're like all over the place and they disappear. So instead of giving them a platform to get up there and start preaching at us, we need to start shaming them into actually doing what needs to happen.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, guys. I think we can squeeze in one last question that we have from an anonymous attendee. So what policy and electoral changes are needed to ensure that DAs charge and prosecute law enforcement agents that engage in police brutality, abuse, and terror?
That kind of presupposes that there is a mechanism for that. I mean, it depends where you live. It depends what electorals, like where you live. The DA is an elected official in where I am, and it's a race that nobody cares about. So we just passed a new use of force law that's arguably one of the strictest in the countries, and we've had some very clear murders of people by police, but DAs don't want to prosecute, right? And so, you know, I don't. It's hard to think of the mechanism you can put in place. They talk about giving the power to the attorney general or this, that. And again, I think this is why, as abolitionists, we try to push the conversation away from this area, because we're just investing in a system that is broken and designed to disadvantage our people. So maybe we could do this and a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and then we spent 5 years and $500 million and have 10 new positions in a new administrative agency, and cops are still killing people and getting away with it. And so what is it for? right? Like we've established that the system is broken beyond question. And so it's time to focus on dismantling the system. And if folks want to, if folks want to contextualize reforms to the system as obvious measures that need to be put in place while we defund and dismantle the police, sure. But that's never, you're never genuinely hearing that from a politician. That's not a stance that they're genuinely going to take. So it's always difficult to sign on when reforms are on the table.
Yeah, definitely agree. And, I also want to encourage people to look into people's tribunals as a people developed mechanism to hold, the state accountable. There was a very powerful people's tribunal after Katrina and the crimes of the police and the state against Black people. And all the killings that happened. And so, the concept of the People's Tribunal is to provide a forum to, to individuals, to people whose rights have been violated by the state, to be able to talk about the violations. And so, the impact of that is really huge, especially, for directly impacted folks. So, if anyone's interested in, talking about the People's Tribunal, potentially collaborating on one or, whatnot, definitely please stay in touch.
Awesome. I think that's all the time that we have. So thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. Thank you so much to James and Azadeh for saying some pretty powerful points. I've personally learned a lot in this past hour. I hope you all have too. And again, I really want to encourage everyone here today to get involved in local opportunities to be able to really make an impact in the movement for Black lives and to really be able to reimagine the world in the way that these amazing leaders have been talking about for years now. So thank you all so much for joining. And again, thank you so much, James and Azadeh, for your time and your knowledge and your expertise. And hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Azadeh.